She arrived at the ranch on a quiet morning when the sun was just starting to rise over the hills. The air was fresh and smelled of earth and grass. The ranch was bigger than she imagined, and the sound of horses neighing filled the air. She had dreamed of this moment for years, and now she was finally here. Her heart was beating fast with excitement and a little fear. This was her chance to work with real horses every day and learn everything she could. From the beginning, the ranchers had warned her about one horse in particular. They called it the cursed Stallion and said it had never been broken. Every rider who tried ended up hurt or frightened, and most gave up. The stories were enough to make anyone think twice, but something about the Stallion called to her. She had always loved challenges, and she could not resist. She wanted to see for herself if the stories were true. The first time she saw the Stallion, it was in a large paddock at the back of the ranch. Its coat was dark and shiny, and it moved with a strength that seemed almost untouchable. The Stallion's eyes were sharp and alert, and it watched her with a cautious intelligence. It tossed its head and snorted as if testing her. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but also a sense of connection. She walked slowly toward the fence, keeping her hands visible and her movements calm. The ranchers watched her from a distance, shaking their heads. They called out warnings, but she ignored them. She wanted to understand the horse, not just watch from afar. She spent the next few days observing the Stallion. She noticed the way it moved, how it reacted to the wind, and how it seemed to sense the moods of people around it. She learned that the horse had been abandoned as a foal and had grown up mostly alone. It had been handled roughly by those who tried to train it and had developed a natural fear and distrust of humans. She realized that the so-called curse was really a result of fear and past trauma. Understanding this made her more determined to try. She began to spend time near the Stallion every day. She carried buckets of water and buckets of feed and left them near the fence. At first, the horse backed away and kicked at the ground when she approached. She did not react with anger or frustration. Instead, she talked softly to it and kept her movements slow. She learned that sudden actions made the horse nervous. She tried to move in ways that felt natural to it, imitating its slow and deliberate steps. Gradually, the Stallion stopped moving away as often and started to watch her with curiosity. One afternoon, she decided to sit near the fence and just be there. She did not try to touch the Stallion or feed it. She simply watched the way it walked around the paddock, the way its muscles flexed as it moved, and the way its tail flicked when it was annoyed. She felt a sense of respect for the animal growing inside her. She realized that she could not force it to trust her. She could only be patient and consistent. Days turned into weeks, and her routine became a part of the Stallion's life. She would arrive early in the morning and stay until the sun began to set. She brought treats sometimes and offered her hands slowly so the horse could sniff it if it wanted. She learned to read the subtle signs of the horse's moods. A flick of the ear, a step back, a tense muscle told her more than words ever could. She discovered that the more she understood the horse, the more it seemed to accept her presence. It was a slow process, but every small change felt like a victory. The ranchers started to notice her efforts. Some were skeptical and reminded her that the horse had never been broken. Others were quietly impressed by her patience and dedication. They watched as she spent hours in the paddock without ever trying to ride or force the horse. They saw the way she would talk to it and how the Stallion began to show small signs of trust, like standing still nearby and following her with its eyes. Slowly, the legend of the cursed Stallion seemed to change in their minds. Maybe it was not cursed at all. Maybe it just needed someone who understood it. One morning, she arrived at the paddock to find the Stallion waiting by the fence. It was unusual because normally it wandered freely. Today it stood still and looked at her with what felt like recognition. She felt a rush of excitement, but stayed calm. She slowly extended her hand, and the Stallion moved its head closer. For the first time, she was able to touch it lightly on the neck. The horse did not pull away. It did not snort or kick. It simply allowed her presence. She knew that this small gesture was a huge step. It meant that the trust she had been building was starting to work. Encouraged by this progress, she continued to work with the Stallion every day. She varied her approach, sometimes walking slowly along the fence, sometimes standing still and letting the horse come to her. She learned that consistency was more important than speed. Each time she was gentle and patient, the horse responded in kind. She discovered that her own fears and doubts had to be controlled as much as the stallion's behavior. If she was tense or anxious, the horse sensed it and became nervous. She had to remain calm and focused, which was a lesson in self-discipline as much as horsemanship. Her evenings were often spent reflecting on the day. She would write notes about the stallion's reactions and her own feelings. She started to understand the importance of observation and thoughtfulness in working with animals. She realized that every horse was different and that the lessons she was learning from the stallion would help her with every other horse she met. She felt a deepening connection, not just with the animal, but with the world of horses as a whole. One afternoon, a sudden storm arrived. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, and the wind began to pick up. Other horses ran for cover, but the stallion remained in the paddock, tense and alert. She did not try to force it to move. She stayed nearby, offering a calm presence. She talked softly and let the wind blow past them both. The storm became a lesson in patience and trust. Even in frightening circumstances, the stallion did not act out aggressively. It began to rely on her calm presence. This small experience strengthened the bond between them and gave her confidence that progress was possible. Weeks turned into months, and the stallion became a constant part of her life. She continued to learn from it and adapt her approach. She discovered that the more she respected the horse's spirit, the more it respected her in return. Her routine became natural and fulfilling. She no longer saw the horse as cursed or dangerous, but as a challenge and a partner. She realized that the process of building trust was just as important as any eventual riding or training. She had grown as a person through the patience, observation, and care required to connect with the stallion. As the first part of her journey came to a close, she stood by the paddock fence one evening and watched the stallion graze peacefully. The sunlight reflected off its dark coat, and the air was quiet except for the sound of distant birds. She felt a sense of accomplishment and hope. She knew the real test was yet to come, but she also knew that she had laid the foundation for something extraordinary. The stallion was no longer untouchable. The first steps had been taken toward trust and understanding. She was ready to continue the journey. She returned to the ranch the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The sun was soft and golden, and the air smelled of damp earth from the previous night's rain. The stallion was already in the paddock, its dark coat glistening and muscles rippling as it moved. It noticed her immediately and tilted its head, watching her approach with cautious curiosity. She slowed her steps and kept her hands open, showing no threat. The bond they had started to form was still fragile, but every day it grew stronger. She began this part of the journey by observing the stallion closely. She noticed the way it shifted its weight from hoof to hoof and how its ears moved constantly, picking up every sound. She realized that the horse was aware of everything in its surroundings and that trust would take time. She did not rush. Instead, she focused on being present and consistent. She spent hours in the paddock, sometimes simply sitting a few feet away while the stallion grazed. She knew that patience was more important than action at this stage. The ranchers still watched from a distance, some with skepticism and others with quiet admiration. They whispered among themselves about her dedication and the unusual calm she seemed to bring around the stallion. They remembered how others had tried and failed. They knew that anyone could be injured if they moved too quickly or misread the horse's signals. They could see that she was learning to listen to the stallion in a way that others had not. This made her feel both responsible and proud. One afternoon, she decided to bring a halter to the paddock. She did not intend to put it on immediately, but wanted the stallion to see it and associate it with something safe. She held it in her hands and walked slowly toward the fence. The stallion watched her, its eyes alert but not fearful. She placed the halter on the ground and stepped back. The horse sniffed it cautiously and then moved away. She did not try to force interaction. She simply left it there and allowed the stallion to investigate on its own terms. By the end of the day, the stallion had touched the halter lightly with its nose. She considered this a small victory. She spent the next several days repeating this gentle introduction with the halter, always rewarding the stallion with calm words and a soft touch when it approached. She learned that the horse responded best when she remained still and allowed it to make decisions. Any hint of pressure or impatience caused it to retreat. This was a lesson in humility for her. She understood that her role was not to dominate, but to guide and support. The horse's wild spirit was not something to be broken, but something to respect. At times, she felt frustrated. Some days the stallion would retreat at the slightest movement or noise. Other days it would approach and seem almost playful, rubbing its head against the fence as if inviting her closer. She learned to accept both the progress and the setbacks. She kept a journal of each encounter, noting small changes in behavior and her own reactions. Over time, she could see patterns in the horse's behavior and adjust her approach. This helped her grow as a student of the animal and of herself. One morning, she noticed that the stallion had a small cut on its leg. It must have been from a thorn or sharp rock in the paddock. She felt a surge of concern but approached slowly, speaking softly and letting the stallion watch her as she examined the leg. She cleaned it carefully and applied ointment with gentle hands. The stallion did not pull away. It seemed to understand that she meant no harm. This moment strengthened the trust between them. She realized that caring for the horse's well-being was as important as training it. The ranchers began to offer her advice, sharing stories of their own experiences with difficult horses. Some suggested different techniques and tools, but she chose to stick with patience and observation. She had learned that forcing the stallion or trying to speed up progress could undo months of work. Instead, she focused on understanding the horse's personality and adapting to its needs. She found satisfaction in the small successes, like when the stallion allowed her to stand nearby without moving away, or when it nuzzled her hand gently. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, the stallion moved closer than ever before. It lowered its head and sniffed her shoulder. She remained perfectly still, feeling the warmth of its breath and the strength in its body. She realized that the horse was beginning to trust her completely in its own way. The moment felt fragile and precious. She knew that one wrong move could break the connection they had built. So she simply stayed calm and present. The bond they were forming was not just about the stallion learning to trust her. It was also about her learning to trust herself and her instincts. She discovered that she needed to remain calm under pressure, to read subtle cues, and to be patient with both the horse and herself. She realized that this process was teaching her resilience, empathy, and the importance of consistency. The stallion was shaping her as much as she was shaping it. One day, the ranch received news of a nearby storm. She knew the stallion could become nervous and unpredictable. She spent hours preparing the paddock, making sure it was safe and that the horse could find shelter if needed. When the storm arrived, she stayed nearby, talking softly and keeping her movements slow. The stallion initially paced nervously, but gradually settled as it sensed her calm presence. She realized that her own control of fear and tension directly affected the horse. This reinforced the lesson that emotional awareness was as important as physical skill. Over the following weeks, she continued to build on the progress they had made. She introduced new objects and obstacles gradually, allowing the stallion to investigate and choose its level of comfort. She learned to celebrate small victories, like the horse following her steps or allowing a gentle touch on its back. Every day felt like a step forward, even when it seemed slow. She knew that true trust could not be rushed. The ranchers began to speak differently about the stallion. They no longer called it cursed. Instead, they remarked on the unusual bond that had developed between the young woman and the horse. Some of them offered quiet encouragement, while others simply watched with awe. She felt a sense of accomplishment but remained humble. She knew that the journey was far from over, and that true success would come only with continued patience and understanding. As the second part of her journey came to a close, she stood in the paddock and watched the stallion graze in the late afternoon light. Its movements were calm and measured, and it seemed to trust her presence completely. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The stallion was no longer a symbol of fear or failure. It was a partner, a teacher, and a challenge that had helped her grow. She knew that the next steps would require even greater patience and courage, but she felt ready. The foundation of trust was strong, and the bond between them had begun to flourish. She left the paddock that evening with a sense of hope and determination, knowing that the real test was still ahead and that the journey would continue. To shape her in ways she could not yet imagine, she arrived at the ranch in the early morning, feeling a quiet excitement that came from knowing she had made progress with the stallion. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the paddock. The air smelled fresh and earthy, carrying the faint scent of the horses in the wet grass. She walked slowly toward the fence, taking care to keep her movements calm and predictable. The stallion was already near the edge of the paddock, its dark eyes watching her intently. It shifted its weight and flicked its tail, signaling its awareness of her presence. She paused, letting the moment stretch, and spoke softly to it in a gentle tone that had become familiar to the horse. The trust they had built so far allowed her to take small steps toward greater interaction. She carried a lead rope and halter with her, but she did not approach the horse with the intention of putting it on immediately. Instead, she wanted the stallion to see the items and associate them with something positive. She placed them on the ground near the fence and stepped back. The stallion approached slowly, sniffing the objects cautiously, then stepped away. She waited patiently, understanding that each action from the horse was a choice and a small sign of trust. Over the next few days, she repeated this exercise, always rewarding the stallion with calm words and gentle touches when it plucked. During this time, she began to notice patterns in the stallion's behavior. It reacted to sudden movements and loud noises with a startle reflex. But it also observed the actions of humans carefully before responding. She realized that the horse had developed a cautious nature from past experiences, not from any curse. This insight gave her a deeper appreciation of the animal's intelligence and sensitivity. She adjusted her own behavior, moving more deliberately and keeping her tone calm. Knowing that her emotional state affected the horse's reactions, she became more mindful of her presence. Understanding that trust was built in moments of stillness and patience, she also started to introduce the stallion to new objects and experiences gradually. She placed a small brush and bucket in the paddock and let the horse explore them on its own terms. The stallion was cautious at first, but began to show curiosity, sniffing and nudging the objects gently. She rewarded every approach with quiet praise and a soft touch on the neck. The process was slow, but each small step felt significant. She realized that the journey was not about forcing the horse to accept her, but about creating an environment where it felt safe to make choices. 1 morning, she noticed the stallion watching her with a different intensity. Its ears were forward, eyes focused, and it seemed to follow her movements more closely than before. She approached slowly and extended her hand, letting it sniff her fingers. The stallion did not pull away. Instead, it leaned slightly into her touch. This small gesture filled her with hope and reinforced the idea that consistency and patience were working. She spent hours near the horse that day, talking softly and brushing it gently when it allowed. Each interaction strengthened their bond. She continued to work on her own skills alongside building trust with the stallion. She practiced walking calmly around the paddock, reading the horse's body language, and maintaining a steady and relaxed posture. She discovered that her own confidence and composure had a direct effect on the stallion's behavior. When she remained calm, the horse was calm. When she allowed doubt or impatience to show, the stallion would become tense. She learned to control her emotions as much as she learned to understand the horse. Occasionally, the ranchers offered advice or shared stories of their experiences with difficult horses. She listened and considered their suggestions, but always adapted them to her own approach, which emphasized patience and understanding. She learned that there were many ways to work with a horse. But what mattered most was respect for the animal's nature and careful observation of its responses. The stallion became a teacher as much as a challenge, showing her the value of empathy, timing, and gentle leadership. One afternoon, a sudden thunderstorm arrived. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, and wind began to whip through the paddock. The stallion initially reacted with nervous energy, pacing and tossing its head. She stayed nearby, speaking softly and moving slowly to avoid startling it. Gradually, the horse began to settle, recognizing her calm presence as a source of security. She realized that her ability to remain composed in stressful situations was crucial to maintaining trust. The storm became a lesson in patience and reassurance, reinforcing the connection they were building. Over the following weeks, she introduced more structured exercises, such as leading the stallion around the paddock with the halter and rope. At first, the horse resisted, stepping back or pulling away slightly. She did not force it, but instead used her calm voice and gentle pressure to guide it. Slowly, the stallion began to follow her steps, responding to her cues with increasing confidence. Each successful movement, no matter how small, was celebrated as progress. She understood that the journey was about building communication and understanding rather than forcing obedience. The bond they shared continued to deepen. The stallion began to approach her voluntarily, nuzzling her hand and allowing her to brush its coat without resistance. She discovered that trust was not a single moment, but a series of repeated experiences where the horse learned that she was predictable, calm, and safe. The relationship was mutual. Just as she learned from the horse seemed to learn from her presence and behavior. It became clear that the so-called curse was not magic, but a lack of trust that had developed over years. She also spent time reflecting on her own growth. Working with the stallion required patience, observation, and emotional control. She learned to be present, to listen without words, and to value small achievements. Each day, she became more attuned to the horse's needs and responses. The experience was shaping her as much as it was shaping the stallion, teaching her resilience, humility, and empathy. She realized that the process of trust building was transformative in ways she had not anticipated. The ranchers began to see the changes as well. Some were still cautious, reminding her of the stallion's history and the risks involved. Others were impressed by the progress she had made and the bond she had formed. They watched as the horse followed her calmly, allowed gentle touches, and even seemed to seek her presence at times. The legend of the cursed stallion was beginning to fade in their eyes, replaced by a recognition of the patience and care that had led to these results. As the third part of her journey came to a close, she stood in the paddock and watched the stallion move with a quiet strength. Its movements were measured and deliberate, and it seemed to trust her in a way that had once seemed impossible. She felt a deep sense of accomplishment and a growing connection to the horse. The path ahead would involve new challenges and tests, but the foundation of trust they had built was strong. She left the paddock that evening with a sense of hope, ready to continue the journey and to see how far their bond could go. The next morning, she arrived at the paddock before sunrise. The air, cool and fresh, carrying the smell of dew on the grass. The stallion was already awake, standing quietly in the corner, its eyes alert and observing her as she approached. She felt a mix of excitement and nerves, because today she planned to attempt something new. After weeks of building trust and establishing calm interactions, she felt ready to take a small step toward riding. She did not rush or force the process, but intended to introduce the idea gently, letting the stallion choose how it would respond. She began by leading the horse around the paddock, using the halter and rope. The stallion followed her carefully, its steps deliberate but unafraid. She paid close attention to its reactions, noticing every shift in weight, flick of an ear, or movement of the tail. She spoke softly to it as she walked, keeping her voice calm and steady. The goal was not to control the horse, but to create a dialogue in which it felt safe to trust her guidance. After several laps, she stopped and let the stallion graze. She sat quietly nearby, stroking its neck gently when it allowed, feeling a deep sense of connection. This moment of stillness was as important as any physical task, reinforcing the bond they had built. Over the next few days, she gradually introduced the idea of touch on the horse's back. She placed her hands lightly on its muscles while it grazed, careful to follow its reactions and back off if there was tension. The stallion initially tensed and moved away, but she remained patient, returning each day with the same gentle approach. She discovered that consistency and calmness were key. The horse began to allow her touch for longer periods, and she could feel its muscles relax under her hands. These small steps were victories. each one moving them closer to mutual trust and cooperation. She also spent time observing the stallion from different angles, noticing how it reacted to shadows, sounds, and the movements of other horses in the paddock. She learned that its caution was not stubbornness, but a careful assessment of its surroundings. By understanding the reasons behind its behavior, she became more confident in predicting its reactions and avoiding sudden movements that might startle it. She realized that empathy and observation were as important as skill and courage in working with a horse like this. The ranchers continued to watch her progress. Some expressed cautious optimism, while others remained skeptical, reminding her of the risks involved. She listened respectfully, but relied on her own judgment and the signals the horse gave her. She knew that forcing progress or ignoring the horse's comfort could undo months of work. Instead, she focused on patience, understanding, and careful observation, valuing the trust they had built more than any quick achievement. One afternoon, she decided to practice leading the stallion over small obstacles in the paddock. She placed low poles on the ground and guided the horse around them, speaking calmly and offering gentle encouragement. At first, the stallion hesitated, lifting its legs carefully and testing each step. She allowed it to explore at its own pace, rewarding every successful movement with soft words and a touch on the neck. By the end of the session, the horse moved more confidently, trusting her guidance and responding to her cues. This exercise taught both of them about communication, trust, and cooperation. She began to think about the first attempt at riding. She knew that rushing this step could undo the bond they had developed. Instead, she focused on preparation. She read about techniques for introducing a horse to a rider gradually, watched videos of experienced trainers, and practiced mounting and dismounting using a stationary horse dummy. She wanted to ensure that her own balance, calmness, and movements would not alarm the stallion. She understood that her confidence and emotional state would be as important as her physical ability to ride. The day of the first ride attempt arrived. She approached the stallion with a calm and steady demeanor, speaking softly and allowing it to sniff her hands. She placed her hands gently on its back, letting the horse feel her presence without pressure. The stallion shifted slightly, but did not pull away. She adjusted her position slowly, feeling the strength and power in its muscles beneath her hands. She remained patient, taking time to let the horse understand that she meant no harm. This moment of stillness and mutual understanding was critical before attempting any movement. Once the stallion seemed comfortable with her presence on its back, she gently applied pressure with her legs, testing its reaction. The horse shifted but did not bolt or buck. She allowed it to move forward slowly, guiding it with calm words and light signals. Every step was measured, careful, and deliberate. She focused on maintaining her own balance and composure, aware that any sign of fear or tension could cause the horse to react. The connection they had built over weeks allowed the stallion to respond with trust rather than resistance. After several laps around the paddock, she dismounted carefully and stepped back. The stallion stood still, seemingly content with the experience. She spent time afterward brushing it and speaking softly, reinforcing the positive experience. She realized that this first ride attempt was more about communication and understanding than distance or speed. It was a step forward in building a partnership rather than asserting control. She felt a sense of accomplishment, but remained humble, knowing that each session would require patience and care. In the days that followed, she continued the gradual process, increasing the length and complexity of the ride slowly. She introduced gentle turns, small obstacles, and varied paces, always observing the horse's reactions and adjusting accordingly. The stallion began to respond to her cues more readily, following her guidance with trust and cooperation. She celebrated each small achievement, recognizing that true progress came from consistency, patience, and mutual respect. The ranchers began to speak of her efforts differently. They noticed the changes in the stallion and how it responded calmly and confidently to her presence. Some offered quiet praise, while others watched with curiosity and interest. The stallion, once called cursed, now demonstrated patience, intelligence, and responsiveness. The story of its untamed nature was slowly giving way to a new narrative, one of trust and partnership. She felt proud, but continued to focus on careful progress. Knowing that the bond could be fragile if not nurtured, she also reflected on her own growth during this stage. Working with the stallion had taught her resilience, patience, and empathy. She learned to observe closely, remain calm under pressure, and value small steps of progress. She understood that her emotional state influenced the horse and that maintaining composure was essential for mutual trust. The experience was shaping her as much as it was shaping the stallion, creating a connection built on respect, understanding, and shared experiences. As part 4 of her journey came to a close, she stood in the paddock, watching the stallion move with calm confidence. Its coat gleamed in the afternoon sun, and its movements were fluid and deliberate. She felt a deep sense of connection and accomplishment. The trust and understanding they had built over weeks had created a partnership that was rare and special. The next steps would bring new challenges and tests, but she felt ready to continue. The foundation of trust, patience, and communication was strong, and she knew that together they could face whatever came next. Continuing the journey that had transformed both of them, she arrived at the paddock in the early morning. Feeling a quiet confidence that had grown from weeks of hard work and patience, the stallion was waiting near the fence, alert and calm, its dark eyes following her every movement. She took a deep breath and smiled softly to herself, knowing that today would mark another step forward in their journey together. The bond they had built was strong. She felt ready to continue testing their trust and cooperation. She began the day with the usual routine of calm presence and observation. She spoke softly to the stallion, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. The horse responded with a gentle shift of weight and a slight tilt of its head, signaling its awareness and readiness to engage. She approached with the halter and rope, placing them on the ground so the horse could inspect them at its own pace. The stallion sniffed the items and stepped back once, then returned cautiously, showing curiosity without fear. She waited patiently, praising it quietly and offering gentle touches when it allowed. Each interaction felt like a conversation, a way to communicate trust and understanding without words. After several laps of leading the stallion around the paddock and practicing calm interactions, she decided it was time for another ride attempt. She prepared carefully, adjusting the saddle and checking her balance before approaching the horse. The stallion watched her with steady eyes, moving only slightly as she placed her hands gently on its back. She felt the strength and power beneath her, and she remained calm, knowing that her own composure would guide the horse's response. Slowly, she shifted her weight, letting the stallion feel her presence without pressure. The horse stood still, seeming to understand that this was a new stage in their partnership. She guided the stallion forward slowly, using gentle cues with her legs and voice. The horse moved deliberately, responding to her guidance while remaining aware of its surroundings. She focused on balance and patience, aware that the success of this ride depended on the trust they had cultivated over weeks. Each step was careful and measured, reinforcing the sense of safety and understanding between them. She felt a deep sense of connection, knowing that the stallion was not just following her instructions, but choosing to trust her guidance. Throughout the morning, she continued these controlled rides, gradually increasing the distance and complexity of the movements. She introduced gentle turns, varied paces, and small obstacles, always observing the stallion's reactions and adjusting accordingly. The horse responded with confidence and calm, following her cues without resistance. She celebrated each successful step, knowing that real progress came from patience, respect, and careful communication. The experience was not just about riding, but about building a partnership. Based on trust and mutual understanding, the ranchers began to notice the remarkable progress. They watched as the stallion moved with calm strength, responding to her presence and guidance with trust rather than fear. Some expressed quiet admiration, while others remained cautious, mindful of the horse's history. She welcomed their observations, but relied on her own judgment and the signals the stallion gave her. She understood that the relationship they had built was unique and could not be forced or rushed. The stallion's behavior reflected the bond they shared and the trust that had developed over time. As the weeks passed, she continued to build on this foundation. She practiced more complex exercises, such as navigating larger obstacles and leading the stallion through varied terrain. Each session reinforced their communication, trust, and understanding. The horse became more confident, following her guidance willingly and responding to subtle cues. She learned to celebrate even the smallest achievements, recognizing that every step forward was a sign of progress and partnership. The journey was as much about personal growth as it was about training the horse, teaching her patience, empathy, and resilience. One afternoon, she decided to practice in a larger open area of the ranch. The stallion moved freely at first, testing the boundaries and observing her. She guided it calmly, allowing it to explore while maintaining a presence that reassured it of safety. The horse began to respond to her direction with ease, turning, stopping, and moving forward at her cues. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that the trust they had built allowed the stallion to act with confidence while still respecting her guidance. Each movement was a demonstration of the bond they shared and the mutual understanding they had cultivated. She also spent time reflecting on the journey so far. She remembered the early days when the stallion had been untouchable and wary of her presence. She recalled the small victories, the moments of patience and understanding, and the gradual progression toward trust. The experience had taught her about the power of empathy, observation, and consistency. She understood that working with the stallion had changed her as much as it had changed the horse, shaping her approach to challenges and deepening her connection to the natural world. The relationship between them continued to grow stronger with each passing day. The stallion began to approach her voluntarily, nuzzling her hand and standing calmly nearby. She continued to respect its space and choices, reinforcing the sense of safety and trust. The partnership they had built was no longer fragile. It was resilient and balanced. She knew that the horse's spirit remained wild and strong, but now it was tempered by understanding and trust. Their connection had become a true collaboration, where both of them contributed to the success of each interaction. The ranchers often commented on the transformation. The stallion, once labeled cursed, now exhibited calmness, confidence, and responsiveness. They observed how it moved with precision, how it responded to subtle cues, and how it remained steady, even in situations that might have caused fear or anxiety in the past. The legend of the cursed stallion was being replaced by a new story, one of patience, empathy, and human-animal connection. She felt a quiet pride in this transformation, but remained focused on continued growth and partnership. As the final sessions of this stage concluded, she took a moment to stand beside the stallion in the late afternoon light. The air was warm and still, the sound of distant birds carrying across the paddock. She placed a gentle hand on its neck, feeling the strength and calm presence beneath her fingers. The stallion leaned slightly into her touch, a silent acknowledgement of the trust and bond they had created. She felt a profound sense of accomplishment and gratitude. The journey had been long and demanding, but the result was a partnership built on respect, understanding, and shared effort. In these moments of reflection, she realized that the real achievement was not just riding the stallion, but the relationship they had developed. She had learned to communicate without words, to respect the horse's nature, and to guide it with patience and empathy. The stallion had learned to trust her, to respond to her guidance, and to accept her presence as a source of safety and understanding. Together, they had transformed what was once seen as a curse into an opportunity for growth, learning, and connection. As Part 5 and the final stage of her journey came to a close, she felt a sense of completion. The bond between her and the stallion was strong, resilient, and mutual. They had faced challenges, overcome fear, and built a partnership based on trust and respect. The journey had shaped her, teaching patience, empathy, and resilience, while transforming the stallion into a calm, confident, and responsive partner. She walked away from the paddock that evening with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that their story was a testament to the power of trust, understanding, and the bond between human and animal.